Hello everyone and welcome to this session. This is the first session of week 13, the policy process. In this session we're going to build on the discussion we had last week on what is policy and what is public policy, and what role does policy play in our lives. On the objective slide you'll see that what we will discuss is the policy making process, and we will describe each of the steps in this process. We will also discuss some of the complexities and the interrelationships in each of the stages of the policy-making process. On our question slide, we have this question. In your own words, so simply put, how would you describe the process of designing and implementing a new policy? Who do you think needs to be involved in deciding what is a problem that requires attention? How do we go about involving the appropriate people? Who is responsible for making these policies? And more importantly, who is responsible for making sure that once a policy agenda is formed and something is put on paper, that that actually gets implemented appropriately? How do we know that once we are implementing a policy to address a problem, that we are actually achieving what we set out to do? Who is responsible for monitoring or evaluating whether a policy is appropriately implemented? To answer these questions, we need to look at public policy and the policy cycle. On slide 3, we see that public policy is a process by which governments translate their political vision into programs and actions in order to achieve desired changes in the real world. But we know that the real world is constantly shifting and changing. It's important for us to have sound scientific evidence when we are designing policy, when we are putting ideas on paper, and when we take those ideas and implement them in the real world. Let's think about the COVID-19 situation. Our government has had to be very quick and responsive to sudden changes internationally that have affected us on the ground. And they've had to come up with a set of rules and regulations to direct public institutions. We need to be collecting evidence throughout this process to know that these rules are having an effect. Essentially, the government set out to flatten the curve. And there have been many unintended consequences as a result of the decisions that were made. So we need to know that what we're doing is actually going to have the desired outcome. So public policies are considered strong when they serve to solve problems efficiently and effectively, and when they serve and support governmental institutions to do so. But also, they need to encourage active citizenship, because these policies have an impact on our everyday lives. And we need to have a voice in what we are experiencing as a consequence of those decisions. Making policy involves a number of stages, and it also involves different people at each of these stages. We know that the policy process is not a simple linear process. It often involves a lot of movement back and forth between these different stages and between the different decisions that are made. Sometimes this can lead to confusion, as I'm sure you've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, that people have made decisions and yet we hear different things from different people in government. And therefore we need to go back and address, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Do we need to shift our way of thinking as situations change? However, there is a simple way of describing the policy-making process. First of all, we have to have a problem that we're trying to address, and we have to set that problem up. And this is the first stage of agenda setting. What is the problem? How serious is this problem? Is it deserving of additional resources? We then need to put on paper how we think we are going to address this problem in order to come up with practical solutions. However, we know that once we've got a draft together, that people are going to have reservations. And in order for that policy to be effective, we need people to buy in to that policy and into those suggested solutions. And there's a process of policy adoption where there's a lot of negotiation back and forth to consider the impact that this will have on different people. Once we are happy with our plan of action, we then need people to put it in place, and this requires a process of implementation. People who are forming policies are not often the people who are going to implement those policies. And when we implement policies, we see that a whole bunch of new problems might emerge that the policymakers hadn't necessarily thought of. Very important, we need to know that when we are implementing a plan of action, that action is having its desired effect. We have to constantly monitor and evaluate throughout the implementation process whether or not we are achieving our outcomes. This slide is a graphic representation of the policy cycle. When we set the agenda of the policy, we have to draw the public's awareness to the severity of a problem. So we raise the profile of a problem in the public domain. By doing so, we grab the attention of officials so that it has political weight and can be taken up through different institutions within government. Once a problem has been identified and there's awareness within society, we need experts to sit with government and policymakers in order to come up with a plan that is implementable, effective, and efficient. However, we know that sometimes that plan is going to affect different aspects of society, and we need buy-in from different people in society in order for that policy to be adequately adopted. Once a policy has been designed and there is buy-in for that policy, there are, of course, resource constraints in terms of implementing that policy. During the implementation phase, many issues can come up that a policymaker might not have thought of. And that policy has to be adaptive and responsive in order to address those issues. How do we know that there are problems? We do that through a process of monitoring that policy and eventually evaluating the outcome of that policy. So when we monitor, we look at different stages of implementation and we see how well are we doing at those different stages. If we pick up that there are problems, we might have to go back and look at the plan. Has the plan made provision for challenges within implementation? We might go back straight to the implementation phase and say we need to address resources in this way in order to improve the implementation of this policy. At the end of that policy, if we see that we have not achieved what we set out to achieve, we might need to go right back to the beginning and say, how clearly did we define what that problem is? Were those parameters clearly set? Or do we need to redefine those parameters because perhaps the condition has shifted, the circumstances have changed, and what we set out to do is no longer useful? Slide 5 looks in more detail at the agenda setting phase. Agenda setting is described as a coalition between experts on the subject, civil society, political and social institutions, where they sit and discuss the extent of a problem, and they come up with initial suggestions in terms of how to address that problem. At this stage, what we're trying to do is define the parameters of the problem by understanding how severe is this issue. What are the other factors that we have to consider in addressing this problem? To do this, agenda setting also raises public awareness. And the media plays an important role in assisting to the public to be aware of the extent of a problem. We see that there are many other institutions that can be used in the same way. Beyond the media, we could have individuals who raise the profile of a problem. We could have institutions or civil society organizations, or even international organizations such as the World Health Organization, who could raise the issue in the public domain. So we see that there are different stakeholders or people who are involved in raising the awareness. And very often, each of those stakeholders have their own agenda that they're trying to push for. So when we look at agenda setting, we have to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the different organizations who are raising a concern. How do stakeholders influence the policy process? First of all, we have to have good scientific evidence. So many people might be involved in collecting that information through sound research processes. Also, we want those stakeholders to assist in the policy process by creating links between existing networks. So that, first of all, we can share those findings with different people, so we can check, are those findings contested? Are there any problems within that research that we need to address to make sure that we have defined the parameters of a problem? We can also run a number of advocacy campaigns to help to raise the severity of this issue in the public domain. By doing this, once the public is incited around an issue, it also raises its political profile. And we can, as a democratic society, for example, we can put pressures and demands on our government in order to address this issue. Slide 6 looks at policy formulation itself. Once an issue has been raised in the public domain and has caught the attention of policymakers, we need to come up with a plan. Policy formulation refers to the process of developing effective and acceptable actions and objectives for addressing a problem placed on the policy agenda. During this stage, we usually invite a bunch of experts who have an in-depth understanding of a problem to come up with feasible actions to resolve those problems. And there's often a lot of discussion and back and forth around what is the most and sensible way of addressing this problem. So through a process of constant consultation, we are able to set a very clear agenda, and policymakers then can define the particulars of a policy. In other words, its plan. Throughout the policy formulation phase, the solutions to the problem are shaped through an ongoing engagement with these different stakeholders. And the feasibility of those solutions is discussed. So stakeholders once again play an important role in the policy process. They can help by collaborating in discussion groups, being part of committees, or entering into public debate. They can provide or seek evidence on policy options, so they can look where else has this issue been addressed, how well was this issue addressed, what worked in a different context. And they can use a bunch of amplification strategies in order to push the goals of the policy. So for example, through a process of engaging with different companies or influencers, we can see that there might be solutions from other sectors. We can ask those people to contribute to that policy. We can engage with the communities who are going to be most directly affected by that policy. And we can look at focusing on creating content that is going to make sense to the people involved. Slide 7 looks at the adoption of a policy. So policy adoption refers to the process of accepting formulated policies for future implementation. So we're not yet implementing the policy. We're just trying to get the different stakeholders to buy in, to say, yes, this is going to work, or this is not going to work for these reasons. So decisions are often made at a government level about the policy suggestions that were formulated. However, we know that policy adoption phase remains a consultative and iterative process. So we sometimes have to go back, and we might even have to readdress the scope of the problem. Through a process of inquiry, through ongoing research, through bargaining or making compromises, and very often making changes to a policy, a proposed policy is therefore refined and finalized so that the implementation will be as seamless as possible. But we know that when we come up with a policy, it can have legislative consequences. So there might be legal issues that are involved. The policy also needs to be adopted by Parliament, so it can be gazetted through Parliament to make it official or in a formal authoritative policy that has to be implemented. So this is actually quite similar to the way that new laws are formed. And I've put a graphic here on the slide to show you that process. Let's use this graphic to discuss, for example, how national health insurance came into effect. So first of all, in 2011, a green paper was put to the public for discussion. This is similar to the agenda setting phase. So you can see here the government is saying, this is what we are wanting to do, and we open up for discussion to the general public. What concerns might they have with us going ahead with this plan? Once those concerns have been raised in the public forum, it then moves into a refined paper called a white paper. And with the National Health Insurance, there in fact were 2 iterations of that white paper. So with the white paper, we then have experts who come in. So this is more like our policy formulation phase, where different experts are identified, they come in and they look at what is proposed and they refine that. It then has to go to Parliament, and this is really where the policy adoption phase comes in. So this is where people might say, hold on, I don't agree with this aspect. It's going to have these political consequences. So a draft bill is put together and suggested in a parliamentary setting. In order for that bill to be adopted, those considerations need to be put in place, and a refined bill might come out, which is then gazetted through Parliament. And eventually, it will get signed into law through the President's office. So you can see that there's a parallel process here between a policy-making process and its legislative outcomes. Slide 8 is about policy implementation itself. Policy implementation refers to the stage at which the approved policies are put into action through the direction of efforts and allocation of resources. So we've got a plan, we know who's going to be affected by that plan, we have to put financial and other resources in order for that plan to come to fruition. Policy implementers themselves are often on the ground, such as healthcare workers or clinical staff, and very often the policy makers and the policy implementers are 2 different sets of people. So those responsible for making the policy can be quite far removed from the practical implementation. It's very important that we understand the experiences of people who have to implement that policy, and we have to collect research and evidence to see what are the problems that are emerging through this plan. So policy implementation is critical to the success of achieving the intended objectives. We see in South Africa that we're very good at coming up with well-crafted or formulated plans, but the disconnect is in its implementation because there are many other factors on the ground that inhibit or prevent that policy to reach its ultimate goals. We need to be engaging with people throughout this process, and here stakeholders play an important role. They can help to enhance the policy communication at different levels, so we can make sure that the national government is communicating appropriately with provincial government, that is communicating appropriately with local government, who is then able to put that policy into effect on the ground. They can also help by supporting the outreach actions of those contracted to undertake those services. So as I've said, there's often a gap between the intention of the policy and its actual implementation. And we have to look at the many factors that can hinder the success of that policy. If that policy is flexible and adaptive enough, we might be able to address this at the implementation phase. And if it's not, we might have to go back to the plan itself and say, hold on, what in the plan has not taken into consideration the experiences of people on the ground in terms of implementing this policy? Slide 9 looks at policy evaluation. Very importantly, we need to see, are we achieving what we set out to achieve? Policy evaluation is a process of establishing the extent to which policy objectives are being achieved. So whether the implementation of a policy is successful in achieving its outcomes can be defined through a use of different metrics, through monitoring and evaluation, and through different forms of reporting. So we can set up at this, when we plan our policy, at what stage are we going to measure different aspects of that policy to see, are we achieving our outcomes? Any implemented policy is measured by its ability to achieve its predefined policy objectives. So we know what we've set out to achieve. We need to know how well are we doing that in relation to the resources we are spending in order to meet this outcome. Is this viable? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Or do we need to make adjustments? Stakeholders usually decide in advance on the key parameters or indicators that we are looking to evaluate to see, have we been successful or not successful? You can think back to the discussion we had last week on the Millennium Development Goals and our current Sustainable Development Goals. For each of the goals that were defined, there were a number of metrics set up to see what would be considered success in terms of achieving the outcome we've set out to achieve. So through the policy evaluation phase, we also need to involve various people. We have to get constant feedback, and usually that feedback is from people on the ground. So stakeholders can be influential in terms of providing that feedback on the experiences of implementation itself. They can also be important in collecting the evidence we need to see how well are we implementing this process. And very importantly, we need to bridge the gap between the policy plan itself and the people who are implementing that, and ultimately the people who are affected by that policy. This final slide is a graphic representation of some of the challenges within the policy process. You can see that there's a lot of back and forth between the different phases. First of all, with the problem itself, we hope that when we come up with a plan to address the problem, that the parameters of that problem are going to shift. Sometimes they shift positively because we are addressing that problem appropriately. But sometimes we can see that we haven't fully understood the full parameters within that problem. We have to go back and redefine its scope. There could be many things that affect this: contextual changes, political changes, social changes, over time. And so we have to be flexible and adaptive to understanding how our problem changes. We also see that when we implement a process, that sometimes things go wrong and people can lose faith in our plans. In order for a policy to be well implemented, we need to have constant buy-in from various stakeholders, from people on the ground who are affected by it, by the people who are actually implementing that policy, by the funders, or a number of other people. So we have to sometimes revise our strategy in order to get that buy-in. Throughout this process, we have to make sure that we are evaluating whether we are achieving its outcomes. Monitoring at different phases of implementation is really important because we can see when problems emerge, what are the root causes of those problems and how can we start to address those problems. The plan itself is just one way of addressing a problem. And so we have to make sure that the plan can be adapted, it can be flexible as problems emerge. So hopefully from this presentation you can see that policy is a complex domain, and it involves a lot of considerations. Very importantly, it involves people, and people have different needs. Those needs constantly shift and change. We have to be responsive and we have to consider various views in order for us to get the best outcomes in the end. With this in mind, you can perhaps understand that why, when we have really well formulated policies, in practice, those policies don't always meet their outcomes. If we think, for example, around some of the fantastic policy directives that came out when South Africa moved into a democratic society, you can see that there were other unintended issues that emerged while those policies were being developed. For example, the sudden HIV epidemic in South Africa had a huge impact on our health resources. And even though we had set out to reformulate our health service through measures which were considered equitable and we're trying to address some of the issues from the past, that's a sudden disease burden had a huge impact on making those goals a reality.